I won't mention that again.
For 30 years.
It might be in the back of our minds about. He had a fire department.
All right.
You know?
Okay, thank you all for meeting at 8 o'clock this evening. It was due to other meetings happening, the Steps to Success event. So we're going to dive right in. This is, once again, a bit of a continuation of previous discussions, so we're not going to do lots of framing and introduction. Feel free, if you feel like you're tuning in to Season 5 and you've missed what happened in Season 1 through 4, to go to the BATV website or the BAG website, and otherwise we're just going to launch into Season 5. Lisa,
All right.
Capital, thank you.
So the Capital Subcommittee, I think as you remember, gave a progress review or progress report about 2 weeks ago where we walked you through how we've been thinking about the capital issues related to the override. And so I'm not going to go through that work again, but primarily what we want to focus on tonight is the impact of the policy options on capital and at what thresholds what capital decisions can be made. We've talked about sort of the chunkiness of capital, and Sergio has put together some amazing work that helps to understand that. So we're going to focus on that, but before we jump into that, I want to just orient people just a little bit, maybe just back to what happened last season in a quick 1 minute. Okay, so just a reminder of our subcommittee's purpose: testing expand in place capital costs, daylighting the capital and cost implications of policy choices, which is really what we're doing today, and then identifying and evaluating the value of unexplored options. One of the things that this presentation will serve to do is provide the basis for the update that our co-chairs need to make to the advisory committee next week, so that's why some of this is repetitive to what you've seen. But so just reminding everybody, and this doesn't look good on screen, but is that our capital subcommittee has been looking at classroom demand and the ways to address that through policy options and capital options. And so I'm just going to talk first about the capital options and just remind everybody, so that because the policy implications are really about capital avoidance, and so we want to just remind you of what we're talking about, so when Sergio jumps into what we may be able to avoid, what that means. This is just, you've seen this before, this is just a reminder of classroom growth from FY18 to FY14. We currently stand at 247 classrooms, and that's the distribution. This is the baseline classroom demand. Again, you've seen this before. This is from Peter Rowe's numbers, his table, and just a reminder of how we get there. It's the number of students, so this is the student growth as it was forecast and presented to us in the fall, which translated to a number of classrooms. Again, these are Peter's numbers. And this line indicates what number of classrooms we would need, additional classrooms each year. So that's the cumulative demand. As a reminder, what we talked about last time was that this is true classroom growth given no policy changes, and that in addition to needing new classrooms in this scenario, there's also this number that the school committee identified. They sort of identified a range of 11 to 13 of suboptimal classrooms, and we've talked about what suboptimals are. If anybody wants to dig into that further, we can absolutely talk about that in more depth at some point. But suffice to say that there are classrooms that, if you had the choice, it wouldn't be where you'd maybe have folks, but they do suffice, and they are legitimate classrooms, just not up to the standard of the rest. So this is the overview of the expand in place, the options that are on the table for capital. And I just want to, again, orient you to our assumptions, because this is where Sergio is going to take off from. We understand that there are 6 BEEPs currently, and that over the next 2 years, 3 of those will be converted to classrooms. That came from, there was some discussion about that when we presented on the 12th of March, and there was some clarification work with Peter, and this is where sort of we've landed. So you're able to capture those as 3 classrooms by 2015 for sure. The Lawrence project, which was modulars, is now more of a standard construction, but is just classrooms added onto the building, could provide you with 4 additional classrooms. 1 of those is 3 classrooms. 2 of those is 3 classrooms. 3 of those is 4 classrooms. 4 of those is 6 classrooms. 6 of those is 8 classrooms. 8 of those is 10 classrooms. 10 of those is 12 classrooms. 12 of those is 16 classrooms. 16 of those is 18 classrooms. 18 of those is 20 classrooms. 20 of those is 22 classrooms. 22 of those is 23 classrooms. 23 of those is 24 classrooms. 24 of those is 25 classrooms. 25 of those is 26 classrooms. 26 of those is 27 classrooms. 27 of those is 28 classrooms. 28 of those is 29 classrooms. 29 of those is 30 classrooms. 30 of those is 31 classrooms. 31 of those is 32 classrooms. 32 of those is 33 class The Devotion project provides you 5 classrooms with 4 additional rooms, so it's really about 9 to 10 rooms in total, but some of them are sort of addressing the suboptimal issue, so that's why we categorized it here. What you're going to see in Sergio's numbers is Devotion at 10 classrooms because it's addressing the suboptimal. So he'll explain that when he gets there, but I wanted to point out that discrepancy and anticipate that. Driscoll, a 4-section, we anticipated that as 10 new classrooms, but only 7 new built rooms because you can capture three beeps at Driscoll. So this chart you've seen before. I'm not going to go through all of the detail, but we can go back to this if it helps you understand Sergio's numbers, but I want to be able to jump into those. On the capital side, we just want to make a few observations before we jump into policy, which is that, assuming that Driscoll can accept the projected number of classrooms, if you make no policy changes, Driscoll sort of barely addresses the capital need or the classroom need. There are also some other pressures that we haven't, completely quantified as a group. The suboptimals are one we have, but then the unknowns around potential additional growth, such as Hancock Village, and also an increased enrollment trends. So the idea there is that, Driscoll, even if it can achieve what we've said it can achieve, you need to be thinking about the next project or alternative projects. And so the recommendations of our subcommittee are to look at Pierce and also to look at some non-town-owned land to just understand whether the options are there to perhaps look at a ninth school. And as we presented last time, that really gets you more classroom size. So if you believe that we were going to have a lot of growth, you might want to go back to considering the ability to get 27 classrooms. But as we presented last time, there are all kinds of trade-offs related to that regarding renovation of schools and all that sort of thing. So I'm not going to backtrack on that, but these are some of the issues that when you go to advisory committee next week, you will be sharing, I'm sure. And then just a reminder on the high school, and you'll see this in Sergio's numbers, the high school is a very important component of this. We don't have good data on the high school. We don't have good program data, demand data, or cost data. We've been carrying a number in the earlier assessment of what an override would be of $70 million for the high school, which frankly just bracketed HMFH's gross assumptions between 40 and 90 million. So we've been carrying that, but it's not a known number, and it is something that we need to, as a group, come to terms with. So that was a quick overview. I hope it provided some framework. Sergio's going to come up. We can go back to some of our capital assumptions if it's needed during his policy discussion, but now he's going to talk about policy, if I can figure out how to get him there. Let's see.
So while Lisa is setting up, before we started this evening, someone in the audience suggested that one way to raise some money for the schools was to sell tickets to the Override Study Committee meetings. Perhaps a version of Faulty Towers. So let me start off here by giving an introductory comment or two first, which is that we know that enrollment demand for classrooms is partly based on residents of the town of Brookline, and it's partly on voluntary admissions by the school committee to various programs. The traditional ability of the town to meet the needs of the schools through taxes and the CIP have been overwhelmed by the enrollment growth. And that's why we're here. We're here because there is a belief that an override is required. And an override is an extraordinary event. It's certainly one that we've done before, but it's not the normal way that we do things. The work of the schools on which we have relied begins with the work of Peter Rowe, who, acting on the instructions of the school committee that there were going to be no changes in policies, was asked to project enrollment demand, and from that, classroom demand. Peter basically assumed 630 children would enter each year in kindergarten between now and 19, and assumed 21 children per class, and got a total of 30 classrooms. Some of those have been provided for already, some suboptimally, and some through space that we had. And currently leaving us with a demand of 20 new classrooms under that calculation to fiscal 19, or 23 by fiscal 20. So the current total of 247 classrooms would increase to 270 total classrooms. Tonight, what I would like to do is to suggest that there may be some other ways and to suggest some possible tools as to how we might consider the problem, and reminding us perhaps also that extraordinary events may require extraordinary responses. In this chart, which I hope you can read, although I could probably blow it up if I had to, up here you see school years beginning with fall of 14, fall of 15, 16, 17, out to 21, 22. And here you see Lawrence, which is coming online in September of 15. So that line runs vertically through here. You see the Devotion School project with its 10 classrooms, which is intended to come online in September of 18, coming through here. And you see Driscoll, which I have arbitrarily chosen to move out 1 year to September 19, partly based on a belief that the current schedule may not be realistic, but that's an assumption on my part.
I'm sorry, Sergio, you said you've moved it out to September 19?
Correct.
So it,
They're all on the far side of the year for reasons which
okay,
will, I think, become clear.
okay,
Okay.
good.
Then, the next thing would be to suggest that there may be some tools that are available to the community and through the school committee which could have the impacts of reducing current classroom demands by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more per year. What those policies are, I'm actually agnostic about, and I don't intend this evening to be so much a discussion about which should be used or shouldn't be used, but rather to simply observe that from the work that was done by our colleagues on the schools program and special populations, we know, for example, that if materials fee program were to be changed in such a way that we might respect all those who are in the system currently, but we would no longer admit new students beginning in kindergarten, 1 classroom per year would be saved. So here's an example of that event, 1 classroom, 1, 2, and each year it just progresses out. The colors are coded to connect to the capital projects that we see up here. So if you were to save 4 classrooms, the yellow indicates that it's equivalent to the Lawrence expansion, which is currently scheduled for 4 classrooms. If it gets to the green color, it becomes equivalent to the Driscoll program, which expands by 7 classrooms, remembering that it's really 10, but 3 of those classrooms actually exist. So there's 7 new ones. And so forth. And you can see from your own handouts, which is down a little further at the bottom of this document, and somebody can tell me actually how to scroll down because it doesn't want a page down.
On the far right, you see the arrows?
And move the cursor to the slider on the far right.
Like a Word document, yeah.
And now just left click and pull it down.
I got it.
There you go.
For those of you who have the handouts, it's easier for you to see, but you can see what the assumptions are. This word criteria might be better understood as classrooms. And then going down, you see that at 4 or more, it's yellow. At 7 or more, it becomes green. At 11, which is the sum of Lawrence and Driscoll, it becomes blue, and so on down the line. See if I can get you back up here. Okay. Here is a program which suggests that if you could save 2 classrooms annually, and this one is being suggested as being done perhaps by a new system of assigning kindergarten students. A new system might mean that families who arrive to this community after a certain date, and I don't know what that date might be. Some have suggested April, some have suggested June, but it would give additional flexibility to the superintendent, and those children would be welcome to our community and told, we have a seat for you, but we don't actually know where that seat will be until just before school begins. If it means that that child goes to a school that's not in their buffer and not in their neighborhood, which could happen, they would be bused, if necessary, to that location. Those families would also be told that if they choose, and if space becomes available in their local school, they have the ability to make the request for that transfer. And if instead they remain happy where they are, they can choose to remain. The superintendent, in his budget message, as you may recall, made a suggestion for a parent center. His concern about registration at the individual K-8s was that the quality of that experience varied from school to school, and he wanted to ensure a more consistent presentation of the Brookline schools and suggested that that might be achieved through a parent center, which I presume would be located here in Town Hall, and therefore would facilitate the idea that at least kindergarten, if not all registrations, might actually take place in a central location. And I would suggest that having that centralized function would make it easier for the superintendent to be more able to optimize class sizes and the allocation of students to those classes. If this scenario were correct, that you could save 2 classrooms, and I think it is a reasonable assumption, then you simply see that progression marching across, going up at 2 per year. And here you see that you can achieve fairly quickly examples in which you equivalent to Lawrence, equivalent to Driscoll, and here is even equivalent to the sum of those. I don't think I necessarily need to walk you through the rest of these. Option C is simply the adoption of both those policies. That gets you to 3, and you can run that out. And then there are other versions which I think are worth talking about, and so I will try to show us those. And these are the third type of opportunity. Cliff in his presentation discussed materials and METCO explicitly, but there is a third possibility, and that has to do with adding a child per classroom. Before I do that, I'd like you to look in the materials that I've handed out. The first concerns kindergarten assignment. You should find a one-page letter from Dr. Schraft, who sent her letter to the Override Study Committee in January, offering some suggestions from her perspective as a former principal as to how that classroom assignment might work. This is something that I found useful and might frame a conversation, but it's certainly not a definitive.
Hey, it's Susan. All right. Okay, you're all set.
It's certainly not a definitive idea. It's just simply a way of thinking about this assignment question. The other document that I think would be useful as I begin the discussion concerning adding a child or 2 to the classrooms, which is this option that's been identified here as F. The 2-page document that I have for you, and which I'm now going to actually try to get to, if I can. How do you think I get to that?
Same thing, just slide that.
This, I believe, is the same chart that you will find on the bottom of the first page of the handout called Adding One or Two Children. I went through Peter Rowe's materials to the Override Study Committee and identified each of the schools, which you see identified on this side. The chart is on the first page. This is adding one child. And here are the current homerooms in those schools, which you see in this case actually adds to 246. One classroom was added, and I have not picked that up. I then looked at those and I compared them to what I understood to be the school's view of class size today, which is for kindergarten 22 to 24, and for 4 through 8, which is what I was concerned with, no more than 25. And I took out those homerooms which already are at or exceed those numbers, of which I found 8. And that left me with a residual of, in my case, 238 classrooms that had the ability of at least taking one child. I then simply, from that, wanted to look at some issues related to the issue of adding children to a school, because we know that there are certain other common space consequences. Just like if you add beds to a hospital, you need to deal with parking and food and laundry. In a school, we have common spaces such as cafeteria, library, gymnasium, art and music, and there may be parking impacts, and there certainly could be office impacts as well. And for myself, I was trying to quantify what those impacts might be. So here's an example. For Baker, turned out that you could add 35 children. I then looked at those carefully, and I made an assumption, which is because MSBA limits us to 3 lunch periods, I said, all right, let me break the school up, K2, 3, 5, and 6, 8, looked at those homerooms, and figured out how many children would actually show up at each lunch period. How many extra seats do I need? And that are the numbers, which range from a low of 9 to a high of 16. I caution you that devotion is the high, and we know that devotion is being addressed already, but in the short term, it's still a big problem. On the other hand, devotion happens to have 6 lunches at the moment, not 3. And Driscoll has 5 lunches, not 3. But here are those numbers. They're, in my judgment, they're modest. They're not 0, but they're modest. We're talking about a table or 2 tables for children. The gym usually would have 2 classrooms at a time. If we're adding a child per classroom, that's pretty simple. We're getting a couple of kids. Library is typically 1, that's 1. So for these kinds of spaces, the big issue is the cafeteria. Whether we have the ability to handle that number of children, I cannot answer, because I have not done a survey. I haven't gone through and looked at each of the cafeterias. But the conservative assumption is the number of lunches. So if we spread that out over more lunch periods, the impact becomes smaller. Let me go back now, if I may, or try to go back.
Sergio,
Yes.
quick question. The gym number is, what is that to represent?
That represents the fact that normally there are 2 classrooms at a time at gym period. And so if you add 1 child to each of those classes, the net increase in the gym is 2 kids. Right? There are the children that were there before plus 2 more. So coming back up to this chart, the suggestion in F is the addition of 1 child per classroom. We saw that the total capacity is 238 children, and if you divide through, that's essentially 10 classrooms. I have somewhat arbitrarily introduced this program starting with 2 classrooms in the first year and slowly growing over 8 years before I actually get to the 10 number. I don't know whether it's could be achieved more quickly. It probably could, but I wanted to be conservative. And there are some issues that the schools traditionally do respect. Siblings would be certainly one example that might slow down the ability of doing this in a consistent way. But over some time period, you can clearly get to that maximum number, in my opinion. And therefore, you see the colors again. The G line, which you have in front of you, and I'm not going to go through, repeats the exercise, but for 2 children. If you flip to the back of the 1 and 2 page handout, you'll see a similar chart with each of the schools, each of the sections, each of the ones that have been eliminated because they already reached capacity. You can see that in that particular case, it turns out to be 47. See if I can bring that one up on the screen. I think we have it here. There were 40, out of the 246 that I was using, there were 47 that if you were going to be over if you had added 1 child already. It left me with that 199. I doubled that to get my 398. The numbers in the lunchroom are again done the same way of looking at those cohorts on the assumption of 3 lunch periods and finding out what the number of children are. Here you see the impacts are now in the range of 18 to, I think, a peak at 43. The impact on gyms would be 4, libraries 2, and so forth. Now, this exercise is really one that I was doing mostly for myself in order to try to understand what was the potential of implementing 1 or more of these, mostly around the idea that it might have the ability to displace some of the capital projects that we have planned. And so let's pick an example. If you could save 7 classrooms between now and September of 18 or 19, depending what year you would like to pick, and if you had the confidence in the policy being applied, then you could say, do we need to expand Driscoll or not? And there may be reasons to do it, but this would suggest that it may not be simply a classroom demand model. Or it may suggest that you want to expand Driscoll for reasons that Lisa suggested, that there is additional capacity required, but it doesn't suggest that the idea of reducing or controlling the number of children is a bad concept. And it's a useful possibility. And this is simply a tool that I was using to try to suggest how that might happen, how quickly it could happen, and what results you might get if you chose to follow 1 or more of those thoughts.
Can I just make sure I understand the 1 additional child? If we take a fairly large year, so there are 28 classes, and let's say 25 of them are not at capacity, then your idea is there's at least 1 classroom that's maybe 18. Somehow by distributing those kids throughout the system, there would be a way to get rid of the class.
There are, I think, 3 primary ways in which the superintendent has the ability to allocate students. The first and most obvious one is the kindergartens themselves. The second are that we have new arrivals, and it's possible that following a similar idea to the kindergartens, you could simply say that if you arrive in Brookline after a certain date, then the same issue would apply, that we'll provide you a seat, we just don't quite know whether it's your neighborhood school. And the third is that all of us have been struck by the term that we've heard used, the so-called churn term. But more importantly, there are in fact a large number of inter-school transfers. That is, children who for whatever reason, their parents moved from one side of town to the other, or find themselves in a social situation which may not be advantageous, who apply to the superintendent and make the request for transfer. So these offer some, I think, opportunities where this population might happen. And I was conservative in applying it, as you can see. I didn't say you get 10 classrooms in year one. I'm letting it happen over some period of time. Whether I've been aggressive or conservative, I think remains to be figured out. I don't pretend.
I
to
really,
understand.
literally was just trying to make sure I
Yeah,
understood the model.
that's all.
Okay, good, thank you.
So,
Sergio, can I ask a question? Just-
please, I think actually this is a good pause. And I also, I want to frame all of this by saying this is a discussion. None of this is definitive. It's all in draft form, and so I'm welcoming comments, ideas.
I just have two questions. One, with so-called late arriving students that would be subject to potentially to the policy that you suggested, do we have a sense of how many of those there are
What-
historically in a given year?
What I'm told, I had inquired anecdotally of brokers, and I was told that the number arriving during the summer was modest, 8 to 10 per district. I've been, however, corrected by members of the school committee who tell me that, in fact, that could be accurate for some schools, but wildly inaccurate for others. For example, I understand that Devotion and perhaps Lawrence might be receiving more like 40 such families. And no, not 40, 20. I don't know. Bottom line, I don't have any good data.
Fair enough. And the other question I had was, how does the suboptimal space analysis fit in here? And if I had a better memory of the suboptimal space analysis, maybe I could do it myself. But.
The schools report to us that over the period of time that they've been under pressure, the town has voted monies called classroom capacity funds to create classroom spaces within our buildings. Some of those are not considered optimal. They call them suboptimals. They've identified to us a number that's been variable around 10 to 12 that exist kind of through the system. Some of those, at least 4 or 5, are at Devotion, one of the schools that's experienced tremendous enrollment pressure. And there, the new construction of Devotion is intended to remedy though at least 5 of those. I mean, in fact, if the school's redone, they're all gone. Whatever was at Devotion is gone. There are others, however, in other spaces. We have not visited these spaces. We've suggested to Peter Rowe that that would be desirable, but we don't have a clear understanding of what that suboptimal means. So we're relying on our colleagues on the schools that those exist and should be dealt with.
Sergio, I'm sorry, you're done?
I just one follow-up. So even on the classroom size and the aspect of it and this other analysis, it doesn't necessarily, it kind of generalizes, doesn't necessarily consider those
It does not. In
suboptimal
fact,
spaces.
if you'd like, you could take the numbers of 238 classrooms that I found were not at the current limits and subtract those 10 or 12 suboptimals and leave yourself with 220 children who could then be distributed. And so you would, I think, still find that you have 10 classrooms, but that's a perfectly valid observation.
Yeah, it was more of a question than a...
No, it's good.
Have you considered the impact of grade? That is, not all the kids are movable from one room to another, depending on how many of them are in a specific grade level?
Are you referring now to adding children?
Yeah.
I think that's right, and we know there are many things that are uncontrollable. A family can arrive in a community and have kids in several grades.
I wasn't thinking of the arriving families. I
Oh.
was thinking more your analysis of adding 1 or 2 kids. There are so many classrooms available in a school, but it doesn't necessarily, if you have kids are in 8 different grades, the crowding or ability to put them into other rooms is going to depend on where the seats are and in what grades. And my understanding is there's more vacancies in the upper grades than the lower ones.
I think generally speaking that's correct because the cohorts are bigger. On the other hand, there's some very distinct exceptions because the very pressure that has created the pressure in the lower grades has also created the addition of new sections. And so those are the schools where you will look in the kindergartens, and you may well find 5 or 6 which have 18, 19, 20, right? Although there are some that are at 22 and
Yeah, I guess my question was if you tried to do the analysis at all, or if that's something you think about doing, or you're just using this for helping you to think through the problem.
definitely the latter is the case. I'm trying to think it through. But in thinking about it, I didn't see that there was really a major impediment, since I've removed the classrooms that are already not able to take an additional child. And I also want to be clear, we would not be suggesting that we should take a classroom that is at the school's policy standard and adding kids. We're really talking about trying to find empty seats that exist within the system.
The counts you have for common spaces, like seats in the cafeteria, is that based on some, what standard are you using? Are you counting chairs, are you using square footage, or?
Chairs.
Chairs. Have you determined whether or not the existing spaces, for example, could especially where the need is relatively small, could accommodate,
I
for
have
example,
not.
an additional table?
I have not. I can only be anecdotal. I can tell you that it's clear that in some cafeterias it's a non-issue, and that there are others which are currently overstressed. I'm told, for example, that children at Devotion who have 20 minutes are unable to go through the food line and the cash line and eat. So clearly there, this is going to be a significant issue and would not be very effective.
On the other hand, that would address the obesity problem.
Other thoughts or ideas or questions?
So I'm trying, Sergio, I'm just trying to understand. So if you take the 238 number,
Yeah,
or 220, if you subtract the suboptimal,
right.
how do you get to that F option where you save? Where you take?
I'm making an arbitrary calculation that in year one, the superintendent could find 45 seats, which is roughly what 2 classrooms are, and in each subsequent year could find some additional ones through these 3 sources that he, I think, has currently, or 2 anyway that he has currently, and a third one that may need to be added for the placement of children.
Okay.
The third one being the idea that if you're a late arrival, you may not, in fact, be assured a seat in your neighborhood or buffer school.
So to just rephrase, so option F, you would save 2 classrooms on the very first year. That would make
An
up,
assumption on my part.
That
It
would
could be
make up-
more, it could be less.
that would make up 45 students or so
Correct,
out of the 238 possible seats.
right. And the next year, that same idea again, so you'd accommodate 90 in the course of the first 2 years, which is about a third of the population of seats.
Right. So at some point, you cap out. You're gonna
I
go
cap
over
out
the-
at 10.
10, but 10 times
220 divided
Okay,
by
45.
22 gives you 10.
Can I just make a point? So you sort of, though, arbitrarily cap the addition at 1, because when you then look at 2 students, you're suggesting 1 classroom, but there are a lot of classrooms where you could add 2 students.
That's
So
exactly.
the way you sort of built it,
Yeah.
you're sort of there is more capacity
I'm
than the
being
1
very-
would suggest.
I'm being very conservative because, as you know, if you look at the spread, while there are some classes that are at 22 and 23 now, there are others that are at lower numbers, and you might be able to actually add 2 kids in the first year and achieve the same kind of a result. But to Janet's point, there are variations in the populations through the system. So it's not an obvious and simple fact, which is one of the reasons why I chose to be what I thought was very conservative in the way in which this rolled out.
I know that Brookline has traditionally had a small student to teacher ratio. Are we aware of anything that suggests that there was a greater tolerance to increase that among the higher levels so that we are able to relax that smaller constraint at the 6 to 8?
I have to start.
Can I make a suggestion that we not actually get into the policy debates themselves? It's an excellent question, but we could go really far down this road of whether or not these are good ideas or
Alberto,
not.
the most important point here is I am not an educator, and so I can only read, and opine a personal view. I think we need others.
Maybe mechanics of the model or how it works, rather than whether or not these things are feasible or good ideas. Okay.
Well, actually, along those,
Kevin,
Fine, I defer. At the risk of incurring wrath, I'll say that I think this is an interesting idea worth exploring. I don't know if that's debating the issue. But
We'll allow that.
okay. So I wonder, I don't know if anyone here can answer this question. I mean, the main idea is to say, through a set of policies like this, can we make more efficient use of our existing space? And it seems like the way to answer that question would be to redo history, right? And say, suppose that we put into place some policies that will allow the flexibility that Sergio is talking about. What would we actually gain? Do we have the information at a level of historical granularity that would allow us to run the experiment?
Well, here's my response to that, which is it would have been, in my personal opinion, very desirable if when in 2004 the schools became aware of the enrollment pressure that they might have considered this. They didn't do that, and I'm leaving that alone. I'm trying to look forward.
I'm with you
That's
looking
all.
forward, but the best information I have to look forward is to go back to the history and say, suppose we had run these new policies in 2004. What would we have, and started then, what would we now in 2014 be looking at in terms of classroom usage, right? And
We wouldn't be looking at an override.
well, that's what I'm asking is whether we actually have the data
Yeah.
to confirm the suspicion.
Yeah, I can run those numbers. I have them. We know what they are, and we've
We
looked
know
at
where people were where and
Yeah.
when.
Well, I mean, it's 10
You have
years.
pieces of it, right? I think
No, I
some.
think we know from the information that the schools have provided about the population charts. Apparently, we have those from 2004, as it turns out. And so you can look at those numbers.
Can I ask a question? How would you do the only add one child per classroom? Some of them are easier, but that one seems to me to be the hard one to figure out.
Because how quickly it would implement?
No. How would you go backwards on that one? Because it seems to me that you're making assumptions about buffer zones. You're making I think there's a level of granularity that you would need that I'm not sure we have.
I think it's fair to
stay
say
within.
that we don't know how many of those families would wind up not at their neighborhood school. That's probably a good statement. But
Right.
I
Or how quickly a seat would become available at their neighborhood school.
don't know. Maybe.
I'm not sure we can actually do that.
Again, going back to what I did early on, there is a great deal of flexibility already built in to the existing district and buffer zone system. There are a lot of kids who live in buffer zones and who could be assigned to either of 2 or sometimes either of 3 or sometimes either of 4 schools without violating the buffer zone policy. And this is something I alluded to earlier. I went back to the 2012 to 13 kindergarten class where we actually used 32 classrooms for that class. And if you assign those kids, and again, this is sort of retrospectively, if you assign those kids in order to optimize classroom usage and assigned just the Brookline students, you could have saved 6 classrooms. You could have reduced 32 to 26 with 24 in a class, or you could have saved 4 classrooms, reduced 32 to 28 with 22 in a class, and you could have then, if you wanted to, added METCO and materials fee, stayed under 24, which is the school's target for K through 3, had Metco materials fee and the Brookline students in 28 rather than 32 classrooms without violating any buffer or district lines. Now, that assumes optimized assignments of those kids to maximize classroom usage. And, you know, that would lead to a saving of 4 classrooms, and that's not being assumed here.
Yeah, I've really been conservative there in
So-
assuming the 2. So
So, you know, it's sort of indicative, and I wanted to add, with regard to that, we did have a discussion at one of the subcommittee meetings with Dr. Lupini about the assignment policy and how the assignment policy is done, and Sergio has alluded to one way to use classrooms more efficiently, which, as I understand it, was sort of a bright line, that kids were assigned maybe under the existing system, and then after a certain date, kids might get assigned regardless of their district or buffer zone, and bust. Another thing that we discussed was, you know, rather than assigning kids to schools in the spring or early in the spring, pushing that back further, so that you, if a child was in a buffer zone, you'd have a better idea of which school they could go to, and you wouldn't have this bright line, but rather you would have a deferred assignment for all kids in order to more optimally assign kids to classrooms. So, you know, there are a lot of permutations and variations on how you could implement a different assignment policy. And I think the one that Sergio alluded to is not the only one. You know, the one that I just mentioned is not the only one. Lee?
Yeah, there are a couple of points that I think we have to bear in mind. We're talking about this policy on a rolling basis. In other words, it would be initiated with an entering kindergarten class and then roll forward. We're not talking about, and Sergio's numbers do not reflect a flash cut across all grades. So you can effectively, once you establish some degree of optimality in a particular cohort, that can essentially remain constant throughout as the cohort progresses. Now, the demographic subcommittee has also, and Alberto may want to talk about this, but let me just sort of talk about it generally, and he can go into some of the specifics. We've been collecting data on movement, both within the town from one school, from school to school, as well as movement entering Brookline at various grades and leaving Brookline at various grades. So we know, and we have the potential to actually model the progression of a cohort through the system, so that, for example, we know that roughly over the 12 grades, something in the neighborhood of 40% of the students who started in that cohort are no longer there, and they tend to get replaced. So even as people leave, as the cohort progresses, you have the opportunity to make some adjustments with the new ones coming in. You know, I think we probably could simulate this. What we don't have is data on, we don't have addresses. So we can't tell you, we can tell you what school they went into, backcasting at any given grade, but we can't tell you whether they were in the core zone or buffer zone. So we can't model with the data that we currently have that that level of granularity. But I think the main point is that we're not talking about a flash cut. We're talking about a rolling implementation.
Yeah, and that is something also that I noted in looking at the data, and that is that and actually this happened, I believe, last year. There was a consolidation at an upper grade because there is this 40% turnover within the class over the course of a cohort's progression through the system, which does allow you to assign kids more optimally to maximize classroom usage in the upper grades, in addition to the kindergarten. It's not a static cohort that you're locked into.
Right,
And by the way, that 40% number, as I understand it, is in and out of the system. It does not include intra-system movements.
I believe
That's
that's
right, I think
correct.
that's right.
So
I mean,
that number's even larger.
Yeah, no, and then what I think is really useful about this is that, look, we've said all along as a school system, it was part for years and years, that small class sizes are expensive, and having non-resident students are expensive, and having essentially the neighborhood assignment model is expensive because you get, you can't move children from building to building. So I think to the extent that we're relaxing those assumptions, and when a new student moves to Brookline in February, and the response is, you may or may not get to go to your neighborhood school for some number of years until a spot opens up, if that is the direction we're proposing with this, then I think what you've done a really terrific job of is quantifying essentially the cost of those policy choices that have been, as you said, implemented and held fairly up until this, this budget crunch, have been pretty taken as a given. And perhaps now they're not a given, and we need to have a robust debate about neighborhood schools and the cost of doing that. And so I think this is very valuable in terms of quantifying
I think that's really the only thing
the
this was
costs
trying
of
to
the
do.
policy
is
choices.
The selection of the policies, if any, is not with this body. But here's some ways of thinking about the problem, which might be useful. That's really what this does.
And I would, let me just add that I don't think that this analysis, or the analysis that I did, really undermines the concept of the neighborhood school. What it does is it preserves the assignment of children who are in a district that is not a buffer zone. It does make greater use of the buffer zones.
That's not actually what I understood Sergio to say. What I
No,
understood.
well,
Okay,
the
so-
analysis that I did, he gave one model for
So I'm
assignment.
sorry, I'm not looking at yours. I'm
Okay.
looking at his. So I'm looking at revised kindergarten assignment system, which says that if you show up after April 1st or whatever date it is.
Yeah,
that-
some date has to be figured out by the superintendent.
Whatever it is, and it might not be a date, as we talked about, it might need to be the last 40 kids, right? It's the last mile, if you will, right? It's not even
Another
a
good
date.
way of thinking about it.
So at some point, you need some number of children to be fungible, and you need to be able to assign them anywhere to make the numbers work, mathematically.
That's right.
Right,
I mean-
so, and you would bus them around, and there'd be 40 kids every year that are bused, and that's okay. I'm not trying to
Right.
say that, I'm not making a judgment on that as a policy. I'm just trying to understand what the assumption is and what the cost is of that policy choice.
My point is that might not be necessary if the assignment of children generally was deferred to
So I guess-
closer to September.
I hear you. So maybe what we need is a B prime scenario. That is what Dick is talking about, because that's not what this one is. Maybe we need a different one.
No,
to
I
add
think
to
I
it.
think they're a form of a revised kindergarten assignment system, and I was able, with pushing it to the limit and saying, look, we're going to assign these kids on the last day, to save 4 to 6 classrooms out of 32. I think if you don't push it to the last day, the saving would be less, but it would not require busing. The analysis that I did not violate any district or buffer zone. It didn't move any child out of a buffer
That's
zone.
fine. I'm not arguing that. All I'm saying is that whatever set of assumptions we're making, it would just be really clear, helpful to have that, so that we would know what is the trade-off that we're talking about. That's it. I'm not arguing the policy point. I just want the footnote.
So I would say, again, I found this very useful in the sense that, again, this is not all or nothing. This sort of, I think, just makes the point, and particularly if you go down the slide, it just sort of talks about the classroom reduction and what that means for potentially for individual projects. One point I want to make is I think it's important on the revised kindergarten assignment system. I think there are sort of two different things there that I want to just unpack a little. One is, could you perfectly or more efficiently place students? And the second is, do you have higher class sizes? So the base on which all of these numbers were built assumed 630 students, which may or may not be right, and 30 classrooms. So it assumed 21 students per class, which is roughly the town average, slightly under, which I understand to be 21 and a quarter. If you reduce 2 classrooms, you have an average class of 22 and a half. So you do have a higher, so it's not just efficiency, it's also higher class sizes, and higher class sizes than we currently experience. So I think we should be, I don't think that there's an unfair presentation of that, but that is the consequence of that. So that's within the 22 to 24, but I will say there are two separate things, and I think they should be described separately when we get, at least I would feel more comfortable describing them.
Yeah, an interesting corollary of that is that with less efficient assignment, you can have an average of, say, 21, but a variation from 18 to 24. With more efficient assignment, you might have an average of 22 and no class over. I mean, if every class had 22, you wouldn't have any class over 22. And we now have classes that are over the policy.
Actually, there's only one currently, but that's right.
Yeah, and some that are well below. So, you actually could probably get closer to the policy without necessarily increasing class size, but they are related.
But if you're, I guess that's the point I want to make. If you are in fact increasing the average class size, you are in fact increasing the average class size. That doesn't mean it's different than the policy, but I think those are different things to me.
Right. You are increasing the average class size is increasing the average class size, but it is not necessarily increasing the number of large classes, and it might mean reducing the number of very large classes.
If you take away if you increase the flexibility of where you can put them, right? There are two ways to increase class size. Either you move the whole distribution to the right, and then you've got lots of 29, not lots. You have a few 28s, 29s, or 30s, or you say, we're not going to do that, we're going to pluck them up and put them in a different school, and then you can move them over to the left side of the distribution. So you've moved up your average, but you've tightened the distribution.
Yes.
That's it.
And this does both.
Exactly.
Right.
No. But there are two ways to get there, and I think Dick's way got there a different way from Sergio's, which is why I was suggesting it be a slightly different scenario, because there are different policy effects of the two things that each
Now, I'm
one was
going to
doing.
take a prerogative here and tell you have 3 minutes to conclude this section, because there's one more slide, and I want 20 minutes.
If you
Not a lot
had
of hands up.
if you had chairs of this committee who took control, we
I
would.
know.
you
I
know,
know.
I have one.
You know me, I'm
I have
never
one
shy.
fact
Lee
question.
and then Kevin, we're going to
Okay, I have one fact question for Sergio. You said there were 238 classrooms with at least one seat. Is that right?
That's correct, based on Peter's information.
Of those 238, if we take those 238 classrooms, in total, how many seats do they have? Empty seats.
There was like 800 and some, didn't?
I did do a calculation which said that if you filled every classroom in the system K-8 to its policy, there are more than 800 seats available.
Oh, yeah, over 800.
The actual number was just slightly over 800. 803 is what I recall.
Yeah, but that also and that increases the average class size by like 3.5.
Absolutely. It puts every classroom at the school's policy size. That's absolutely
No,
correct.
but it does suggest that even with a larger class size, there's still some flexibility to move people around if you're prepared to accept the same variation that we have today.
But again, this is where I think the footnotes are important. So would it assume, well, it assumes slightly different things. Because it assume, right now, we will allow by parent choice, we will accept parent requests to move from school to school. For special education reasons, we will move kids from school to school. For language reasons, we'll move them from school to school. There are a variety of reasons why they move school to school. So I think that Sergio was trying to say that you wouldn't ever try to capture all 800, I think, because there are so many legitimate reasons why you would, that's a really bad idea.
And I wasn't suggesting that.
No, I know, but all I'm saying is that it's just, I think you were trying to be conservative, right?
Very much
Yeah,
so.
no,
In fact, I've got
my
less
point
than half.
My point simply was that, in other words, it's not like there's only 238 slots and we're going to use every one of them. The point is there could be situations where some classrooms would get no additional kids and others might get 2, for example.
Okay, why don't we move on?
Kevin had one more
Okay.
thing. Sorry.
I mean,
Oh, sorry.
Let me just, first of all, say, I think there's less difference among these than you think there are, Susan. They're basically minor variants on each other. But the main thing I wanted to say, I mean, Lee is saying that he didn't have the addresses, right? If we could get a group of people who are looking into this to have all the relevant information that they would need, right? They don't need the exact address, but they need to know what schools are assignable under current policy, right? Which buffer zone they're in, what other restrictions there are. and when they signed up, then it becomes possible to simulate a set of policies, like instead of April 1st, we're going to do May 1st. Instead, we're going to use the policy if you can assign anywhere if they come in after July 1st or whatever. You can simulate these things and see how much they buy you. And of course, you also have to think about how much they cost you, because there is an impact on whether we have neighborhood schools or not. But I think it would be an enormously valuable service to have this type of data that would allow someone to simulate a
Override Study Committee, year 2?
I'm sorry, looking at the time, Sergio, you
Yep.
were saying?
So I just want to do 2 small items before I leave this one chart. The first is that I would like to simply observe something that you already know. Some of the policies actually reduce the number of children, and that's important because it has consequences to the high school. Here, the light color represents the number of classrooms that the high school is currently reported to be under, roughly 20 to 21, depending on whose high school report you read. But not all of those come from a reduction in enrollment. So it doesn't translate directly to the high school. Okay, let's leave this and go now to the last of the slides here, if I can get there. And you have this handout as well. So in the end, we're gathered here to offer advice to the Board of Selectmen, the school committee. What was that? I missed it.
Sounded very religious. It's ceremonial. We're gathered here to.
If you think if you think I look like a rabbi, it's not a coincidence. So we're gathered here really for the fundamental purpose of giving advice to the school committee and the town and the voters about the override. And so one of the things that I wanted to try to do sooner rather than later was to begin looking at what these options are and what does it mean to have a double-digit override and how do you define that and what happens if you manipulate it. This is largely illegible to most of you. And so I think you're going to have to look at the handouts. But let me just tell you what's going on. Case 1, across the top, is what was presented to us by Sean and Dick in January. It's based on the idea that there is a devotion override project for $77 million on the town share, of which none of that is coming from the CIP, okay? It also included an assumption that of the $54 million that was left in the CIP, because we were going to override Devo, Sean proposed to split it, $27 million to Driscoll and $27 million to the high school. And what I've done is I've shown you that $27 million in those top 2 boxes, one for Driscoll on the top and then the light green, the high school, and added to that a reasonable assumption about an MSBA participation for those 2 projects. When you do that, you get a $39 million number for the Driscoll expansion, a number which I think the capital subcommittee feels is probably too low. And you get another number for the high school of about $39 million, which frankly we don't know whether it's 0 or 100, but that's what you get. It's the placeholder. The next column simply shows you the $77 million assumption for capital, and below that a $14 million figure which was given to us again as part of the override for the purpose of supporting the operating budgets of the schools. The debt service on that $77 million is in the next column at $5.3 million. In the next column, I've added up the $5.3 million and the $14 million to get to the override number that was published, $19.3 million. Next to that is the calculation done by Sean, which is that that was an 11% increase for the average single-family homeowner, as I recall. Next to that is a 3.6% number, which was reported as the annual increase that the average homeowner would face anyway, and the last column simply adds those up.
So may I just interject? Let me just say that there was some discussion after the meeting about that 3.6% annual percentage increase. Some argued that we should use the 2.5%, which were allowed under Prop 2.5. Others argued that, in fact, the increase for the average homeowner is greater than 2.5%. So let's just...
And more to the point, each of you are going to have to make a decision for yourselves about whether you believe this is the relevant column, that is the override alone and its percentage, or whether you want to consider it with the so-called annual increase, because there's certainly two schools of thought on that issue, and you can weigh in on your own with the board, the selectmen, and anybody else on that. Again, I'm just trying to put the numbers down in a consistent way so that we can think about them.
Right, but the number on the ballot would be the override percent increase.
I believe that would be accurate.
Okay.
Now, the number 2 case up here is very simple. It takes everything that was done in case 1, except it corrects the Driscoll number to be the 54 million that we believe is actually necessary for the expansion as currently defined. In order to do that, I need more of the CIP dollars, and the result of that is that there are fewer CIP dollars left to do the high school. So there you see Driscoll carried out at 54 million, but the high school is now left with only $23 million. Okay? Very simple. That's all it does. And therefore, the percentages and everything else are unchanged. In the third case, I decided to try to take something from our earlier color chart, which was, supposing you were able to say that policies could eliminate the Driscoll expansion. Then what you've done is you've freed up the CIP dollars that we were holding in reserve for the Driscoll work, and you could choose to apply some of those dollars to the override. So instead of trying to do an override for the $77 million town share, we could put some, and in this case I've chosen to put all of it. There's the 54 million now in the CIP column being allocated, so that when you look here in the column under the override dollars, it drops to 23. Why? Because 23 and 54 hopefully adds up to 77, right? And when you drop the override portion to 23 million, you drop the debt service from $5.3 million down to $1.6 million, and you see that there. That therefore changes the total sum of the override to 14.2 million, and that changes the percentage. There's an override that's at 8%. Okay? It has one major consequence, and that is that, it has a major consequence, which is that there is no action at all at Driscoll, no renovation, no expansion, but more importantly, there's no money for the high school, okay, which is why that's been flagged.
Why does the operating expense go down?
Because in eliminating the Driscoll expansion, you theoretically have removed 10 classrooms. Using Beth's numbers at $140,000 a classroom, we took out $1.4 million from the operating side.
So that's assuming that you reduce classrooms by increasing class size, not by reducing population. Is that
No, actually, but let me think about that. Say it again. It assumes.
Well, so $140,000 per classroom. Well, so there's a few things. So one is $140,000 per classroom is for kindergartens only. There's actually a range of, if I'm speaking off the top of my head, I think it's 98 to 140. The upper grades have a lower cost per classroom because
Then the number would be adjusted accordingly.
right. And then and that is if you only lose the classroom. So that would be for class size related policies. If we change policies about non-resident students, there are other costs that you also would save, building-wide costs, for instance. You save more than just the classroom. So
Sure, but I've picked that up by changing the capital, right?
No, no, like non-classroom support.
Say
and-
specialists?
Oh, I see, okay. All right.
And
Anyway,
special
I need,
education
we
costs, and
need
so-
your input to do this math
Yeah.
correctly. So, again, this is a draft, and I appreciate the fact that there are going to be
Well,
changes.
the other thing is that Beth's number is basically a one-year budgetary number, and if we're looking out several years, we probably need to raise that differential to reflect something close to the long-run cost.
Well, and it's even more complicated, because in the case of Driscoll, 3 of the classrooms actually exist, and 7 would get built. So they clearly have different premises on the cost side.
Right, so it's entirely fair to say that one of the exercises that we have to do is to actually build the budget, Lee, as you're talking about, a multi-year budget,
Right.
which will do a number of things. Some of those costs will go down, average teacher salaries will go up, you'll lose the aid after the second year. Like, there's a bunch of stuff that's gonna happen, so we'll do all that.
I think it's fair to say that this is informative
Yes,
and
exactly.
instructive.
It's great. It's
But not
terrific.
definitive. So
Not
we're
only
not,
that,
we're
but
not building an override vote yet.
I'm actually, I want to be completely clear that all of the documents that I've put forward tonight are put forward in the idea and the spirit that each and every one of you will actually generate your own versions.
Oh, God.
Make your own. Pardon me? No, I mean, I'm dead serious. The frame is there, and you're able to now go in and manipulate and say, well, we need more operating, or no, we need less capital, you know, and you're free to go. And I hope you will. So option 4, very briefly, is simply an example in which I decided to be completely arbitrary and find a solution that ended with an override plus the 3.6 that was not in 2 digits, meaning it's below 10%. Completely arbitrary exercise, and I was just interested what happened. I used the same CIP assumption that the money was being devoted to devotion. That reduced the amount of capital in the override to the 23 million. We have the lower debt service, and the only variable left at that point to achieve the 9.9% is to drop the assumption on the school's operating budget. And I remind you, it started at 14 million. It may have dropped to some lower number because we saved some classrooms. Here it's dropped to a little under 10 million.
And that's a plug, right?
It's a complete plug, right? It's exactly what I backed into on this exercise.
And that could also be addressed by revenue.
It could be addressed by revenue, it could be addressed by many things. And by the way, there's.
Or you could go to 999.
You could do that too. That's 3 digits. The 5th case is an example where I've decided to say, well, let's not put all of our money and the CIP towards the override. Let's be arbitrary and put 30 million of our 54 there. And you see the consequences on the debt service. The debt service is now at 3.2 million roughly, or 3.25. And why did I pick the number? Because that left me $24 million of our CIP, which is the subcommittee's working number for a Driscoll renovation only. Okay? So I chose to fund the Driscoll renovation in this example, and the rest of it works out. You can see what happens. That the override still turns out to be plus the 3.6. It's still at 9.9%. What you lose is you don't get any monies for the high school.
And you lower the operating.
Because that's how I got to the 9.9%.
Same.
It's a complete plug. You have to remember that we're the capital subcommittee. So we were being completely liberal with the operating side. And actually, it's an important point to bring up, because I think on the capital side, I hope that you now understand that it turns out that the capital should be thought about in thresholds. There are projects which you either do or don't, right? So saving a half a classroom is not as important as one, and saving 4 or 7 or 11 become more magic numbers because they relate to things that we're doing. The same must be true for operating. There have to be pieces, structural, catch-up, technology. I don't know what they are, but they have some similar quality where you want to make rational choices about what the number is, not a plug number, but a real number. And I don't know what those are, but I think that's part of what we're going to do.
So Joe, can I just say, I mean, I really appreciate this. Part of what you're doing in these later things is allowing a degree of fungibility between CIP spending and operating budget spending that our current policies do not allow. Right? We have policies that set capital spending as a fixed percentage of something related to our total budget.
This is the same 54 that meets the budgetary guidelines that we have.
No,
I
but
haven't
when you-
created any new CIP.
No, but you're allowing, if you save those some of those 54 million, you're allowing that to go to the operating budget, are you
No.
not?
No.
Then I stand corrected.
I'm not.
Then I'm glad I asked.
Yeah, no, in other words, I think you're correct, that the override, that the assumption on the operating side is still always consistently remaining as the override. And I have not moved CIP money to the operating side of the budget.
Okay, good.
Good question, I appreciate the clarification. Yeah,
In the number, bless you.
Which
In
one?
the number 5 scenario,
yeah.
you have no MSBA. Is that an act of caution, or has the MSBA gone to the devotion funding
No,
in that scenario?
I think-
Why is there no MSBA for that?
That's a very good question. This capital subcommittee has made an assumption, which may or may not be right. If Driscoll is expanded, there's a reasonable likelihood of MSBA participation. If Driscoll is only renovated, the chances of MSBA participation, I think, is significantly less. It's not zero, but it's less. And so, again, being conservative, I just decided, okay, let's make that assumption. It's all on the town side. We're not going to get any help. Fair enough?
No, it doesn't sound fair, but it's.
But I'm not the MSBA, fortunately. Let's see here. Let me see if I can figure out how to gently slide this just a whisker more down. There we go. Okay. So the last two are fairly simple. Number 6 is the original case 1, meaning as proposed initially by Selectman Banka and Sean Cronin, but it chooses to, again, arbitrarily get to a 2-digit override out here, but provide funding for both a Driscoll expansion of a partial size. You can see there's only about 39 million there, and $39 million for the high school. In other words, it's the same scenario of Sean's 27 million divided here. And once again, the plug number is the operating budget for the schools, which is now around 6 million. Okay? Then I decided to be arbitrary, and the very last one says, well, why go out for an override for 77 million? Let's go out for 100 million. Why not? You know, it's just paper exercise. Let's see what happens.
Sean having a heart attack?
Well, I thought it was actually interesting because the biggest change is that it changes the debt service over here, and you can see that it changes it from $5.30 to $6.50, or in millions, 6.5 million, right, rather than 5.3 million. Wouldn't that be nice? And
A decimal point here, a decimal point there.
it gives you an override at 9%, interestingly enough. It gives a $9 million figure for an operating number, which, you know, may or may not be reasonable. And you can go from there.
Where'd that come from?
Which?
Well,
The operating number is the plug.
the 9 million, that's a plug, okay.
It's a plug to do an override at 9%. But what was interesting to me was, and I think we now understand this, the amount you borrow for capital turns out to be relatively insensitive on its impact to the override. Why? Because we're spreading it out over 25 years. So it's something to keep in mind.
Where did the original 14 million in the case 1
You know,
come
I
from?
defer to Selectman Banka because that number was handed to us. I have no idea where it came from.
Well, that was,
The-
Sean is here too.
That was the that was the structural deficit plus technology plus the catch-up, the so-called catch-up and enhancements aggregated together.
Yeah, Sean's nodding his head. So that's where it came from. It came out of the school
Those were,
committee.
that was the total of the numbers presented to us in the October presentation by Sean and Peter Rowe, which was the structural deficit kind of going forward, plus the November presentation by Peter Rowe of catch-ups and enhancements, plus the December presentation on technology.
Okay, now that is,
The 1.6 million, not the backed up 800,000 technology? Was that the full-fledged?
That was the,
That was
that was the full
everything.
ask.
It was everything.
Full, yeah.
Full ask.
Which has now been
Yeah.
restated because some of it's happened already, so, or in FY15. So anyway, this has to, but I think you're just a starting point, right?
Yeah,
so
no,
the
I
question,
mean-
the question I have
not an
is,
ending point.
is on that OpEx number, some portion of that, I expect, is related to capital-related costs. If we don't build a new building, we don't have nothing to maintain. If we don't expand a building, for example, then maybe maintenance is somewhat less. So that might have some effect. If we increase class size but keep the number of without affecting the number of students, that's a different OpEx number than if, for example, we reduce the number
Exactly.
of students.
Exactly.
So
exactly
the
right.
question, I guess, I'm asking, and I don't, is there a way to tease those effects out of this number so we can look at the same kind of analysis, same kind of cases, except that on the
We
OpEx
certainly
side of
hope
it?
so. I hope,
Isn't that kind of like the next step?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, those are the projections that we're trying to build.
Right.
No. Tomorrow morning, is it tomorrow morning?
I think Lee may be asking a more complicated question.
No, I think I understand his question, which is to say that, so you have the operating, which then affects capital, which then comes back and affects operating again, because there's building maintenance and other things that are related to whatever your capital decisions are. So
Well, I'm not sure the operating affects capital. I think it's the other way around.
No,
Capital
operating policies affect
Oh,
cap.
policies affect capital, capital affects OpEx.
And then capital goes back and affects operating.
And I think we're all in agreement that there are some direct operating and direct capital and indirect operating and indirect capital. So Lee, to exactly your point, different policies affect different pieces of that
Okay.
equation.
I mean, I think the structure that this basic structure that Sergio has laid out is very helpful, and I think we can try to follow it both on the CapEx side and the OpEx side. It's just that the OpEx numbers right now are arbitrary, and I think that's where we have
Right.
to.
Well,
They're not arbitrary, but they're
Well, no, they are arbitrary. Other than the 14 million number is
The ones
Oh,
on here.
sorry, I'm with you. Yep, you're right,
I mean,
sorry.
we simply
I didn't
took,
understand.
you're right, we simply took the gross, what you see here, that 14 million is simply taking the gross numbers that were presented without digging into the assumptions behind those or determining what the impact on those would be of reducing the number of classrooms,
or
for
students,
example, or the number of students,
right?
for
Okay.
example.
And can I just,
So ultimately, I mean, if you looked at a case where you're eliminating Driscoll, you might actually have a few scenarios that get you there. So there might be eliminate Driscoll via increasing class size, eliminate Driscoll via, and then those sort of sub-scenarios or whatever you want to call them are going to give you different operating numbers. So we'll probably have more iterations of this in the end.
One other comment.
It's the combination of options that we talked about the other night. We have to come up with a variety of different scenarios to give some color.
One
And I
other
also
comment.
like to
oh, Lisa.
Go ahead.
I'd also like to caution, going back to something that I said before Sergio made this presentation, is that, that the 10, so if we were to eliminate Driscoll, you're eliminating 7 or 10 classrooms. And, I think it's important to recognize that we've made the assessment that even if you built Driscoll, if you didn't have policy changes, you would just be meeting your need. You wouldn't be addressing a lot of the suboptimals, et cetera. And so I just want to, and you wouldn't be preparing yourself if there was more growth than anticipated. And so I just want to you know, this all looks very appealing when we take a look at it, but I just want to remind people that not building Driscoll, you're sort of in that exact same spot. So we just need to keep that in mind and think long-term as well.
Right. I think that, so I think one of the things that will be really important when we do these scenarios is to say kind of what is the implication, exactly like that, right? So this one, you probably, you know, if we're wrong or right, what happens? Because I think the one piece that, I mean, I'm totally fine if we're, one of the assumptions we're making is that Driscoll and Piers don't get renovated in the next 5 years. They have to, like, you'd have to assume that they would get pushed out to past this time frame or something. As long, let's just say what that is. Or we'll say that, you know, high school is rising by to 2,500 and the amount that you get is 20 million versus the high school isn't rising to that level because you're reducing population, and so therefore only giving them 20 million, it's a totally different answer. So all I'm suggesting is that when we get here, it's 8-10 layers down probably before we can pull it back up to those. I guess the only other thing I would ask is when we do these scenarios that there's always the what if we're wrong question. So we're using 630 as the number because you can't do anything else. But somewhere before the end of this process, we have to do the what if you're wrong, like, oh, for example, this fall we're getting 650 or something, right? So what does that mean? Because again, if we just solve the problem, then, you know, then that creates some effects. If you, and if you're wrong the other way, if you're overbuilding, what would you do? I mean, the answer up until now is you just backfill suboptimals, right? So we've got all these suboptimals, we're not gonna build for them, but if we're wrong and populations start going down, then you start backfilling those suboptimal space, or beeps, you bring back beeps or whatever. So I think just the what if we're wrong is really important as a sensitivity analysis.
Well, except,
We also have to, we're at the point, I think we're also at the point now we're approaching where we have to give a what if Hancock Village happens.
That's right, so put Hancock, so right, so that's not in here either.
well, but that's also not in the next,
Well, but I was gonna, I think that it'd be interesting to know where the town feels if Hancock Village moves forward, what the time schedule for that might be. And also related to that, to the extent that anything needed to be done at the high school, what's the timing of that? Because one of the things we've talked about is making sure that whatever we come up with, that there's a message to the populace as to what they can be expecting 2 or 3 years after they vote for this override. And I don't know if we need to try to factor that into some of our analysis or not, but it's certainly something that I personally am thinking about.
Yeah, no, and I wonder if we don't have exact numbers, we can at least say it's out here to be dealt with in the next 5 years.
one other thing, though, is,
Just a minute, let me try to speak to the high school, because it's an issue that I share, and I think it's a very important one. I think what we have to understand, however, is the following. The schools have commissioned a study. Today we heard that a consultant has apparently been selected, and we should have some answers. I'm not exactly sure when, but it's probably summer. I'm going to suggest that until you find out what that study tells you, it's probably very premature to put any number to the high school.
I was as much thinking about timing.
Well,
as
that
anything
answer
else.
also comes, we know now, right now, that the high school will, in theory, based on the HMFH study, run into problems starting in 2017, okay? That's 3 years out. However, we also know that there are a lot of classrooms there which, between 2009 and 2013, got repurposed, 16 to 20 of them to be exact. One obvious policy is that for 17 and 18, for example, you reclaim 3 to 5 of those classrooms to meet the incoming demand, right? Pretty easy to do. You might even do it for 3 years. And by then, you have other options suddenly opening, including the fact that Old Lincoln will come online, having been freed from its current needs for the populations at Devotion and possibly Driscoll. So it's a very complicated question, which has answers for costs that go from not quite 0, but maybe 5 million, to potentially a 2-campus solution, which is now a number that nobody knows. Is it 100 million?
On the capital side, forget about the operating side.
Exactly.
And what about Hancock Village? Can you give us a sense as to where that process stands and, you know, if it moves forward, how quickly it could move forward?
It is, I'm not going to predict. It is before the ZBA now, and where it might go would depend on what happens during the appellate process. But
Okay, how about a range of time? You know, I mean, well,
Not,
it's going
not,
to go to the
not-
state Supreme Court, it's going to take, you know, 10
Yeah,
years, it's going to be.
can we say no sooner than something?
I get, let me see if I can get you
Okay,
a more
just,
definitive
The,
answer.
you know, the other thing I wanted to say in response to Susan's, you know, what if we're wrong question. One of the policy options that Cliff outlined the other night was the idea of capping non-residents at some fixed amount. In other words, that is fixed total, so that if we would say we would accept have a total of X entering kindergarten, and if that number is if the resident number is less than that, we'll take non-resident up to that amount. That's another way to address the what if we're wrong, is sort of by committing in advance to a specific, you know, number. It would vary the amount of the non-resident population that would be admitted, but it would tend to give us more predictability on the total size.
And what it would require would be deferral of decisions about admitting non-resident populations until we knew better.
Correct.
What the incoming resident population was.
But that is one of the options that we should be considering.
Exactly. Okay.
I just wanted to make two small points. One is that in this chart, I happen to have chosen gradations by a classroom chunk, but I think it's fairly clear that you could get half classroom chunks from some combination of things, and you should not ignore that, right? And that's certainly a valid way. So it's got a richness to it that's implied, even though I haven't laid it out here concretely. The second thought is that the point that I think my colleagues have made about thinking about the future, I want to be clear that this chart is not intended to say that you should eliminate anything. It just says it's the equivalent of Lawrence, or it's the equivalent of Driscoll. I'm using that for impact, not because I'm really suggesting that you shouldn't do something. Okay? That's a very important point. I'm trying to help you understand how powerful fairly small changes in the way we do things can have over a period of 4 to 5 years. Okay? That's the point. And therefore you might say, you know what, we should build Driscoll no matter what, even though who's going to go in there are the suboptimals, or who's going to go in there are the beeps. You know, I don't know what they are. It doesn't necessarily follow that just because we control the number of kids, you decide you're not going to build. It's just a way of thinking about what it would mean should the town decide that there are some opportunities here which are worth thinking about. And remember that under normal circumstances, most operations, a business, a town, a school system, should respond to externalities. You can't just say, full speed ahead, pass the money, right? That's what this is trying to suggest.
Thank you very much. Any other comments?
I've been here a while, so I haven't been here to remind about how are we coming along on a schedule. And I really think, I'd say this seriously, I've never worked on something that's gone on this long. I don't know when it ends or how. And I don't know how you talk to other, I don't know how people in town understand what our process is if we don't understand it. So I've been here a while, sorry, but I'll raise it again next time. But if it would be helpful to have a subcommittee to think about steering and timing, I mean, I feel very strongly, you know, Meehan's greatest invention is a deadline, and we need one.
So I think the deadline that we are all working towards with hope and prayer is the end of June. I think that between now and then, the big pieces of work are essentially what we've said, which is that the subcommittees have to wrap up their reports, and that we need to do essentially some modeling that pulls this all together and be able to understand these choices in dialogue with each other. So to that end, I mean, I think one of the things that Dick and I did was try to frame out what are ways to reconfigure our subcommittees, not really reconfigure, but think about them a little bit differently to get this analysis done. So do you want to?
Sure.
Turn the microphone?
There is actually an email that is going to be coming out to the chairs of the schools task forces and to the capital subcommittee, basically asking you to develop something along the lines of a 5-year financial model. And I know you're already talking about this, but basically to have those subcommittees and task forces working together to develop a financial model for the school's operating and space needs with scenarios in terms of changes that could be based on that model, much of what you've seen today in Sergio's presentation, and the revenue that would be needed under various assumptions from either override or non-tax sources. And the model would address the question of sustainability in terms of future revenue needs looking forward. Given, and this is really much, I think, of what you did in your last slide, Sergio, given enrollment growth over the past 5 years and the projections going forward, where are we headed and what steps would be needed to meet future budgets. The process, we think, would likely involve taking projected classroom demand, assuming the status quo with capital and operating costs, and then outlining reduced classroom demand with associated capital and operating costs, assuming various options. I think much of which you've also really started or indeed laid out today. It would involve consideration of the capital projects that could or could not be avoided, pulling together the work of the various subcommittees, and indeed you have done that with your colored boxes here already. So I think what we're asking is that the schools task forces and the capital subcommittee really get together and pull all of the work that you've done together so that we can start modeling this on an ongoing basis. Okay? Now.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
To Tim's question, though, and I'm sorry, Timothy.
No, go. Sorry.
Is that's no? It should be called what you want to be called. To Timothy's question, we are running sort of on different tracks from where we started, and I'll say as chair of the demographics subcommittee, we thought we would have one report, but it seems to be one wave coming in after another. We do have a date, and it's a date set by the Sloan School, who is helping our committee. And on May 7th, the students from the Sloan School are going to make a presentation, a model of kindergarten acceptance, and where we are with the kindergarten coming in. So that piece affects how we're moving along, which is different from what we thought we were going to report, which was going to be a critique of the MGT and where we are with that. So I think we're on. I really agree with you that we need to, kind of know where we're going to be with it. But I'll just speak for the demographics. This looks as though once we incorporate the Sloan report, we'll probably be working, I don't know, Sergio Lee. Sergio has given me an assignment for next Thanksgiving to bring to dinner. I mean, this is more ongoing because of the nature of it and what's happened.
No, it's helpful.
Yeah.
And we can keep going because there are a couple more emails that we're about to send to all you. So.
And there's also going to be an email to the municipal subcommittee, basically asking, again, noting that it's time really to start pulling together the most important analyses that have been done and to develop them into scenarios for consideration by the full committee. And on the municipal side, this would involve identifying the various potential efficiencies, service reductions, or revenue opportunities that your subcommittee has identified and providing your analysis of their potential savings and impacts. And we're aware of issues such as the number of fire companies, police and fire staffing, DPW equipment acquisition and staffing, street sweeping, solid waste removal, IT, that you've been considering. The email is basically asking that we start pulling together those analyses in terms of potential savings and impacts. And here, we are asking the question of whether there are any further analyses that you feel should be done and outlined, including some that might require outside expertise, items that might have a major budgetary impact that you would recommend that we perhaps look for an outside consultant on and make that request to the Board of Selectmen for some consulting funding. Similar, yeah, go ahead.
1 second.
Well,
Sorry, just to clarify.
I want to actually
Sorry, just to
interrupt
clarify.
you.
Can I just clarify that? So when we talk about a consultant, it wouldn't be a consultant that we would all wait for and do something with. It would be a consultant that this committee is recommending that the selectmen hire to do something. Okay, sorry.
So here's what I'd like to do. I just want to remind us all of the following points. If you are trying to conclude by June, here's what you're going to miss. Sometime in July, August, a report on the high school. Sometime between September and October, an MSBA decision on the Driscoll SOI, are they going to play or not? And in March of 15, a commitment to a funding agreement for devotion. Now, I'd submit to you that those are each one 3 huge capital pieces. So I don't know what you're going to ask us to give you in June.
No,
We got it. We're with you. And we're not meeting until March of 15.
no, I just, just to be clear, I think what, and this, I thought we had discussed in an earlier meeting, that we really are trying to pull together the work that the committees have done to this point by June, and then we had talked about a September and October date, recognizing that additional information is going to come in. The March 15 date is so far in the future, but we recognize that there are other studies that are underway. What we had hoped is that all of the work that has been done now, that there would be a real concerted effort to try to bring this to coalescence at this point, so that it doesn't go on and just sit over the summer.
Right. So can I just strengthen that, which is that, every 3 to 6 months for the next very number of years, we're going to be getting new and really important pieces of information. So I guess what I would hope is that we can build a model that when new pieces of information come in, that some group, the selectmen, the town administrator, the deputy town administrator, the school committee, the superintendent, the deputy superintendent, can update the model that we're building with that information and sort of recalculate our position, our course and position. So I don't think that this committee, if I have any say in this, and I might or might not, is going to be meeting into 2015, and hopefully we're not even meeting past the summer. What I would hope is that we can pull this together, that we have a model, that we say, here's basically what this thing looks like and what the major decisions are. Here's when you, selectmen and school committee, are going to be getting new pieces of information, and here's how you incorporate those new pieces of information. But I think for us to continue to meet throughout the fall is going to put everyone else on a time frame that makes them unable to do their work, specifically the selectmen and the school committee.
I'm not so sure of that conclusion, but I think the way that I was thinking of this is that the summer tends to be a time that people lose traction and committees lose traction, and I just hope that we'd be able to wrap up what we can. I guess am not so convinced that we will not have to gather together again, to quote, in the fall. But you know, I think there may be some significant events, as you noted, Sergio, that will require some thought. What I had hoped is that all of the work that has been done to this point, including a lot that we saw this evening, will inform decisions of the selectmen and the school committee and the town going forward in this period that we're in right now, including fiscal year 15. And that people who are making decisions will be aware of the fact that decisions that are being made will have consequences down the road. And I think that this sort of analysis makes that clear. But I do think we want to get this pulled together. We also are going to be communicating with the schools task forces, asking that in addition to the space-related questions that I addressed earlier, that are kind of an interface between schools and capital, that the programmatic questions on the school side, like the programmatic questions on the town side, be addressed and pulled together as best you can now, with analysis of potential savings and impacts by the various subcommittees. And those obviously include the proposed catch-ups, the enhancements, school technology, and potential revenue sources. And again, there's the question of whether you believe that there is any issue that you would recommend an outside expert be involved in for longer-term analysis. One thought was that special education might be one of those, given its significance in the school budget, and whether there's a way to do it better and more efficiently, or whether it is being done now as well as it can be. So I think that's it, with a thank you to everybody, not only for tonight. And let me just say, Alberto, you know, the revenue subcommittee is on this track, and finance is on this track. You know, you basically to pull things together. You know, we've seen what I think is virtually your end product at this point.
Just in terms of
Oh, pension,
benefits,
yeah,
there's-
pension also.
I just want to say the report is drafted.
Yeah.
And I have feedback that I have not had a chance to look at and incorporate, but none of the things we've said to you are going to change.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
a reminder, next week, on April 2nd, we're going to be doing a presentation to the advisory committee. It would be helpful, we expect, hopefully, the co-chairs to be there, the subcommittee chairs to be there. If anybody, everyone else is welcome, since you will have 7 o'clock, since you will have things to say, I'm sure. The second thing is we'll be meeting the week after next. What I'd love to see, because there's a 2-week break, is if each of you can kind of come up with either your first pass at what it is that you're going to try to model. We don't expect a final model in 2 weeks, of course, but just how you're thinking about it, what considerations you're putting in there. Then people can give you feedback on what it is you're modeling, so that when you go build the model, it's what people are helping or hoping to see. Does that make sense?
We want to know what our assumptions are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, how you want to build it, what your sources of information are, what types of things what the assumptions are, what the scenarios are.
She wants to know how many simultaneous linear equations you're going to have.
Yes, I do.
200.
May I make a request for the co-chairs to send that email to the municipal subcommittee, so that at 7:30 in the morning we can discuss the email in greater detail tomorrow morning? And then also, to Tim's point, we only have 13 Wednesdays left before the end of June, so it's a lot to do, and I'm not sure I can see the plan.
Right, and one of those is a school vacation week.
And one of them is the advisory, so that's 11 Wednesday.
Well, there's town meeting in there.
Yeah, well,
Right.
we can meet 2-3 times a week if we need to.
Or we can keep meeting this
Well,
fall.
it's just
Beth? Beth?
Speak loudly, but, so I think that the emails are helpful for some guidance. I mean, I think a lot of those things are things we were doing anyway. I don't actually think that's what Tim was asking for.
No, I know.
So, I mean, I think ideally what would be really helpful, which I've said a few times, is here is the calendar of meetings that we have. Here are the ones that are happening. Here are the ones that are not happening. Here are the things that we expect to happen at those meetings. And even to start to think about, as we pull together a final report that synthesizes all these things, I mean, we have to start to think about what is the process of actually doing that, which we haven't even begun to think of. So I at least from my perspective, that when we say a roadmap, I think that's what.
So
we
part of
would
the
really like.
problem is that when we do have deadlines, people miss them. So I have to say, as a co-chair, I'm not hugely confident that if we did set out deadlines, people would meet them. If you want, we can try, and I'm happy to. I mean, it strikes me that the way to get.
I mean, I think we need something that ends at June 30th and has the date set back
Fine.
into it, so we know that we're
Fine.
behind. Yeah.
Fine, we can do that.
Yeah.
All right. I've told Susan that, and I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say.
You can tell which one of us.
I know.
Thank you all very much.
I was in the airport terminal, then in a taxi. Anyway.
That could be great. I miss you all. At some point, we do have to have a meeting just to figure out how to do the final stuff that they want from us.
Yeah. I would love to, well, I wonder